what were some of maybe top 1 to 2 things about property management you feel like people should know about, or mistakes that you've seen people make in property management?
I think that sometimes a developer maybe doesn't appreciate the toil that goes into making sure the projects run smoothly. And also, I think we often forget that those are the folks on the front line, the staff that are collecting the rent. They're dealing with residents that present with many different challenges, and how incredibly difficult that line of work is. So I think you could build the most beautiful, fantastic building, and if it is not well operated, it will not be a success. And so do not underestimate the need for excellent property management that gives integrity to the residents and treating the residents with respect, but also understanding the financial responsibilities and keeping that as a going concern, as a financial asset. So it's people and money. So the hard competencies.
What type of mistakes do you typically see asset managers make? Or maybe something that could have prevented, or something that you learned from that the audience can take away from today and make sure that they don't make those same mistakes in their asset management career?
Property management and asset management work very closely together. What I typically see is taking for granted the budget because somebody put it together and you think, oh, they know what they're doing. And you don't get into the asking why and the forensics. So really looking at a historical benchmark, looking at the numbers and really thinking very closely of, does this make sense? It's sometimes that sounds very basic, but having a curious mind will really make you excellent in your career in anything, but especially when you're dealing with somebody else's work product, to just peel that back a little bit more of like, oh, I see a trend here, but why is that trend happening? Or I see a big change here, not just glazing over it, like kind of getting in there and asking the right questions, because then that can help everyone in the long run.
Welcome to another episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Guys, today I am truly grateful. I am so blessed because we have Stef Kondor coming onto the podcast today. And when I first read about Stef's award as one of the women of influence and how she's been able to develop over 1,000 units, not only did I know that she was going to be a great guest for our audience, but she's a role model for my daughter. And that's something very personal to me. And to see a woman rise up in the world of development and help so many people at the same time, it's just so inspirational. So Stef, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Stef, I've been so excited since I talked to you on the phone for just 5 minutes. I'm so grateful. Like I told you on the phone, most people ignore my messages, but I can tell how giving of a person you are because you responded and because you expressed your interest to share your stories so you can inspire other people. So I'm just so honored that you're on the podcast today. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, somebody that wants to actually talk about affordable housing, something that's near and dear to my heart, I was like, yeah, I'd love to talk about it.
Oh, well, who is Stef and how did you even get into affordable housing in the first place?
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town in Oregon, kind of had a journey to getting to college. I went to community college and then transferred into UC Berkeley at the Haas School of Business. Worked really hard, but also there was some luck involved there. Went into a business program, went into banking, worked at Wells Fargo and their headquarters down in San Francisco, and realized what a great education and opportunity it was, but I needed to be more connected directly to the projects. And somebody that had went through Haas, I had stayed connected with, and she'd went into affordable housing. So I ended up getting an opportunity to work over there. But I really went from working in banking and commercial lending for real estate and into property management and affordable housing, very different world. And I don't think a lot of people were kind of surprised to go from Haas, which is a very notable program, to go into affordable housing property management. Was like, what are you doing? And I was like, well, if I just get my foot in the door, they're going to see that I can do a lot more. And I'm always with the mindset that I wanted to eventually get into development. So went into their operations, oversaw a portfolio of 55 properties up and down the West Coast, really doing like their budgeting, looking at their financing. And then from there, got promoted into asset management, working with investors and covenant compliance and cash flow waterfalls, and then still somehow kept my original work with budgeting and overviewing that. It just grew. Nothing ever went away. And that was during the recession. So there was no opportunity for getting into development. That particular crew of 50 developers went down to, I think, one or two developers. So I got an opportunity to work with a lot of different on wind downs of different projects and assisting. And I think that's the thing, is just being open to learning. And when the opportunity arises, just be ready.
Wow. So let me kind of frame this in such a way that you went to college, you went to university, you went in banking, then you went to property management.
Yeah.
There's so many people out there right now that are in finance that might not be completely satisfied with their careers, right? They want to make
Right.
more impact with their time.
Yeah.
What sort of skills did you take from banking, whether it was finance, underwriting, accounting, knowledge, budgeting, that helped you translate those skills towards property management, asset management? Like, what stood out to you or helped you stand out?
Yeah, I think banking is a fantastic base because it helps you to look at a deal from a risk perspective. And when you think of real estate, you think of, there's a lot of different prisms in real estate. So you've got your finance and lending aspects, you've got your valuation aspects, you've got your operational aspects, your asset management and your development. And each side of that prism really does make you a more holistic person. And so I think the banking attributes gave me assessing risk, looking at financials, doing forensics, looking at credit. How does a bank actually look at your deal? What are they looking at from an underwriting perspective? Really gives you kind of that, okay, how is this seen in the world if I wanted to get debt and equity in the deal?
I love how you explain that, because I think having that knowledge, right? People can just say, hey, I know the bank is going to ask this question, or I know they're going to ask for these supporting documents. Before I even approach a bank, before I even say, let me lock up this land and try to turn to development, you have to understand, when are you going to be able to get money for it? Because if you don't have lending, you don't have a project.
Right.
Unless you have 100% equity.
Right. Well, and even from the operational perspective of like, how does the bank look at an asset, how it operates? What are the things that they're looking for? What are kind of the baseline underwriting metrics that you should be thinking about? And then just risk, even from an operational or an asset management. I mean, there's so many different areas where a project can go sideways. So understanding how they assess that really does make you a very strong person to get ahead of the issue. That's the whole point, getting ahead of it, no matter what lens you work in affordable housing, because I think they're all super necessary and require intelligence and competencies that one may not have. A developer doesn't see an operation from an operational perspective sometimes, whereas an asset manager might not look at it from a developer's perspective. So the more you can understand the different perspectives, the better off your deal is going to be.
I love that. The amount of pre-planning that you're doing, because now you're bringing together all the parties. Everybody feels like they're included as part of the plan from the beginning. So you have that buy-in when the time comes. It's not like you build it, you forget about it. You actually got the net operating income meet the goals to service all the debt that you incurred. So I love how you talk about risk management, because sometimes people just talk about real estate and they think, oh, it's passive income. But no, this is a business. You have to kind of stay on top of everything. And you got to understand that there are line items in a P&L that can directly measure how your asset is performing and how you want to manage it. So you started in property management stuff, and let's dive into that a little bit. What were some of maybe top 1 to 2 things about property management you feel like people should know about, or mistakes that you've seen people make in property management?
I think that property management is the foundation for the deal. And I think sometimes a developer maybe doesn't appreciate the toil that goes into making sure the projects run smoothly. And also, I think we often forget that those are the folks on the front line, the staff that are collecting the rent. They're dealing with residents that present with many different challenges, and how incredibly difficult that line of work is, and to have complete like reverence and respect for the work that's like the boots on the ground that are doing. So I think that was something that I learned very early on from my boss that I think like raised me in affordable housing. She taught me to just have a lot of respect and appreciation for the hard work that's going on day to day, right? It's the sexy glamour job is the development job, right? Because you're getting to spend money and build these beautiful buildings and create. And it is a wonderful opportunity, and I don't take it for granted. But you could build the most beautiful, fantastic building, and if it is not well operated, it will not be a success. And so do not underestimate the need for excellent property management that gives integrity to the residents, right? And treating the residents with respect, but also understanding the financial responsibilities and keeping that as a going concern, as a financial asset. So it's people and money. So the hard competencies.
And I love how you really emphasize people, because I mean, I tell people all the time, I mean, when people live in these apartment buildings or single family homes, what do you want to call them? I mean, you're dealing with people that are spending the best days of their lives in that home and also sometimes the worst days of their lives in that home. And
awesome.
I mean, if you want to talk about financials, I mean, just think about one of your biggest line items on your P&L. It's the vacancy. If you don't take care of your residents and take care of issues when they come up or show that you care, I mean, they will probably leave.
Right.
And that will significantly impair your ability to cover your expenses if you have a significant amount of turnover and vacancy. So, Stef, you went into asset management next, and I view asset management as kind of the layer that works across and managing the property managers, if you will. What did you learn about asset management, and also how did that job differ when you made that progression from property management to asset management?
So in asset management, that role is really going deeper. You're still looking to focus on the operational aspects. That's still a component of it, but now you're getting into more of the partnership docs and the agreements that you made with lenders and equity investors and the subsidy, like whether state agencies or local jurisdictions, and understanding the agreements that you made. So the covenants, understanding just all of final financial attributes and making sure that you're executing that business plan. And I think it's just a more in-depth understanding of how the deal comes together, the bones of the deal, how it financially works and the structure. So that was very eye-opening for me because I was seeing this one piece of just the financials, the profit and loss statements and the cash flow and things like that. But then this is just an elevated attribute. So we'll say. Mm-hmm.
And going from property management, it's almost a little scary, right? You had to let go of some responsibilities, right? When you became the asset manager or went to that role, would you say, or did you hold on to a lot?
I didn't let go of one thing. I think I just added more of the picture, but still just my role grew. So nothing really went away, but it gave me a bigger in-depth understanding of the properties. And so then I could pin back of like, oh, so that's why this property has the certain unit types that it does and the rents that it does because we've accepted this funding. So it was just building out a deeper understanding of the project, a little more in-depth.
Ooh, that's so good. So now that your role has grown with the increased responsibilities, I mean, not just referring to you and your experience, like what type of mistakes do you typically see asset managers make? Or maybe something that could have prevented or something that you learned from that the audience can take away from today and make sure that they don't make those same mistakes in their asset management career?
Property management and asset management work very closely together. And so from my perspective, what's really important to focus on is that I see mistakes is like the operating budget, the projected operating budget. What I typically see is taking for granted the budget because somebody put it together and you think, oh, they know what they're doing. And you don't get into the asking why and the forensics. So really looking at a historical benchmark, looking at the numbers and really thinking very closely of like, does this make sense? It's sometimes that sounds very basic, but I think of having a curious mind will really make you excellent in your career in anything, but especially when you're dealing with somebody else's work product, to just peel that back a little bit more of like, oh, I see a trend here, but why is that trend happening? Or I see a big change here, not just glazing over it, like kind of getting in there and asking the right questions, because then that can help everyone in the long run.
Sometimes we don't have healthy skepticism sometimes in this professional where we're hoping that everybody else knows what they're doing. But let's say you're looking at a pro forma and you're seeing 5% rent growth for the next 5 years. And you're like, hey, do you think that's really sustainable? Or why do you think occupancy is going to stay 96% when you have 1,000 units of supply coming in from a third-party market study? Because now all of a sudden, those lenders are probably going to be asking you the same question. So you must as well ask them up front with the person who's doing acquisitions, with the person who's doing underwriting. And I think that's where people with financial experience, that's what you can bring to the table right away. I used to be a CPA. I don't have that license anymore. But when I got into this world development, I knew that I wasn't going to know anything about construction. So I had to develop my skills from financial plan analysis, and how do I apply that towards this industry in real estate? And part of that is asking some questions. And like Steph said, just be curious. Hey, where'd you get this assumption from? Because if you're an asset manager, you're going to be held accountable to meet those numbers. So you better understand why those numbers are what they are today. So great point there, Steph. I really love that you brought that up.
I love budgeting in general. I like the patterns. I like the way that it tells a story through numbers. I mean, I know that sounds kind of funny, but I think that good budgeting can be the make or break. And also understanding somebody's perspective. Like I would have certain portfolio managers that I knew would try to like overpromise. So you also have to understand the person behind the work of like, what is their personality type? Are they an underpromise, overdeliver, or are they the vice versa? So you have to like think of those dynamics that are at play of what are they reflecting.
Wow. You just married perfectly like people skills and technical accounting skills because you went way deeper than just looking at a pro forma. You say, who is the person prepared for it? That is so good. That's such a golden piece of nugget. I really hope the audience replaces this whole section about asset management, because if you can ask the right questions, people can tell the type of quality of person that you are and the type of candidate that you are, especially if you're trying to get into the world of development. They can tell how smart or curious you are or how passionate you are about something simply by the questions that you ask. So I love this stuff. What other stuff about asset management have you seen that has translated towards your career and development and has really helped you think further ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think that having those early connections with investors are really important. From a developer, you have to have those relationships to get people to invest into your property. So having those relationships, building those relationships, and I think that it goes a long way in any aspect in your career of being consistently somebody that is reliable, that you can deliver on. And so now I'm interfacing with investors. They know my quality of work. They understand how I look at projects, how I execute on things. Really helped me in development down the road because I could point back to the work that I had done before. And that kind of actually lent the road. It opened the doors for me to get into development through just continuing to build that skill set and knowledge about affordable housing, because it's a huge world and it's very complex funding. And so I like that I kind of took smaller bites and kind of eventually felt that I had a good understanding. And then it led to being confident in developing and making, I think, good decisions.
Yeah, I mean, your experience is just so well-rounded. It's no wonder that you got into development and you understand how all the pieces kind of fit together. And when you got sort of into your formal development role, what was sort of the biggest learning curve that you had to make that leap going forward?
It's such a different world. I think the political backdrop is something I really underestimated and didn't quite understand. I mean, oftentimes you are getting states and cities and counties and jurisdictions to give you millions of dollars for you to execute on their housing initiatives, right? Here I am behind a desk doing property management and asset management. Development is much more front facing. It's out in public. It's really working with public-private partnerships. There's a lot that goes into bringing in nonprofit partners into my deal that are doing resident services or some specific outreach and engagement component, working with a lot of different jurisdictions to execute their city goals. It's a very dynamic role, much more front-facing, much more big communication skills, big in negotiating, a lot of negotiations.
Ooh, this is so good. And I love how you brought this up. And thank you for being honest, first and foremost, about underestimating, because not everybody will try to say like, oh, I underestimated this. So thank you for the honesty. And when you have to balance the wants or the priorities of so many people, from the cities, the lenders, investors, and your own construction, your development company, how did you approach not just negotiating, but like, how did you approach bringing all the pieces together? Like, how would you teach someone like, I don't know, your own kids, like, hey, how do you make everyone happy? Because that almost seems impossible.
Yeah. Well, I think when I first started, it was don't look down, kid, just one foot in front of the other. And what I would do is kind of like decision trees. I'm sure the people that were with me were kind of crazy, but when you're undertaking something that maybe initially that you don't have a full understanding for, I really do say like break it down into small parts and look at like what are the overarching priorities. And then from those decisions, what's the trickle down effect, right? So I always look at it as a decision tree. Now I can just do it in my head, But I literally would like write it all out of like, what are the things that we have to do? What is the sequential order that it needs to happen in? And what happens when I make that decision? What is the effect, right? And so anytime you're doing anything big, break it down into pieces and prioritize. What is the most important things to get to here? And I think people describe development as the 30,000 foot view of having that real macro sense of where are we going, but the ability to go very finite and look at this one aspect to understand how it relates to the overall thing. So I think that was really important for me, is just the decision-making skills. And I think that anytime that you are interviewing for a development role, that's what we look for, is what is your ability to analyze and decision make and communicate? Those are kind of the real key pieces. Like, how do you make a decision? How do you see risk? How do you convey a message or a plan to someone? Really critical.
Oh, I love that when you got to development, there's so much more soft skills involved, from communication to balancing the wants and the needs from so many people. And I loved how you threw in the risk in there as well. It's because, well, how do you balance the wants from the county, right? You might say, hey, what are the chances of the city or the county donating a parking lot to build affordable housing? And now as a developer, you can take some risk off the table because you didn't have to buy the land. You don't have to service a debt on the land while you're getting the project through. So all these pieces of the puzzle, there's different levers to make, quote unquote, a deal work if you're able to manage the risk effectively, or just say, hey, maybe I want to make less money, quote unquote, but in return, I get to take this much of risk off the table. And if everybody can have that sort of risk reward ratio in the back of their head while you're going through this decision tree process that Steph just alluded to, I mean, that's how you can really set yourself apart and prepare yourself for this world of development. So I'm just glad you brought that up, Steph.
Yeah, I think predictability is a really important attribute, especially for affordable housing development, because there's such time sensitivities with funding and applications for funding. Sometimes land is donated, but sometimes you're acquiring land. And so matching up your purchase sale agreement with all of those timing aspects with funding and things of that nature. So the predictability is critical, like for entitlements, for funding, all of that you're trying to like project out and make sure that you can hit all of those things, because the execution is critical. Because people are giving you, like I said, tens of millions of, maybe even more, and they want somebody that is reliable to execute, somebody that is going to make them look good, that is not going to become a problem for them, and that somebody that they're going to enjoy working with. Who wants to give somebody all of the responsibility and all of the money and power that isn't going to be a good partner, that isn't going to be a fair partner? I always say, in any partnership, whether it's with a city or with a nonprofit partner, the tenets of a relationship are the same that you have with any partner, right? Trust, communication, integrity, it's all the same things. You have to display those. And so you have to convey that in all that you do, because it's a high public profile role, high risk.
So good. I mean, so many people think about financial risk only when it comes to real estate, but they forget about reputational risk, right? What happens when you mess up? You don't get that many second chances, unfortunately, in this world, especially if you screw up tremendously. And execution risk, knowing that you're teaming up with somebody like Steph that has been through not just the development arm, but also been through different pieces of the whole sort of value chain, the whole end-to-end process from project to operating a project, that gives you tremendous confidence. So Steph is someone you want to learn from, because she can give you a holistic perspective of everything that's going on. So don't underestimate the reputational risk, the execution risk, because sometimes they can't attach a number to it, but it's definitely
so
a
key
factor.
Yeah. It's lovely to describe and get people excited about something and have these big visions and dreams. But if it is not executable, it is a waste of everybody's time. And I know that sounds like very hard, but it's so true. It's great to dream, but I look at deals of how do we get this done? I call them a lead boots deal, where it's just got so much trouble that you're never going to get it done, that people have overpromised. So I try to be very balanced in what I believe that we can do. And then if I can add things that are accretive to the deal, is not detrimental to the deal, that doesn't put lead boots on the deal, then I do it. But if it's going to be something that's really an impediment to getting it done, I won't do it. I just say, no, it's not possible. I'm not doing it. Because the reputational risk, reputation is everything.
And you have such an even keel approach to it, Steph. I really admire it because you don't seem like a person that gets overexcited. It's like, we will just simmer down a little bit. Let's just look at the deal. Let's really kind of peel back the layers a little bit and see what's going on, not just assuming someone's saying pro forma and you just take it at face value, which I can tell just from all the questions and how you answered the questions earlier. So when we talk about getting a deal done, obviously financing a project is one of those parts to get the construction loan fully funded, et cetera. Steph, how do you typically fund your development projects?
Everything that I do is with low-income housing tax credits, first and foremost. So 4% and 9%. So that's 20 to 25% of the capital stack. That's the tax credit, the equity, basically in the deal. You have an investor come in. And then we have tax-exempt bonds with the 4%, which is basically like the mortgage on the deal. That's the debt. Depending on your affordability in there, you can make up maybe 30 to 50% of the capital stack. And then the remainder is soft debt, which is what we call subsidy, which is usually a long-term debt, 55 years, hopefully 0% interest, that a city, a state, or some jurisdiction puts into the deal. And anytime any of those things, right, you have requirements with the low-income housing tax credits, you have requirements with this subsidy funding that'll say you have to deliver this many units, they have to be long-term affordable for sometimes it's 30, 60, 99 years affordability at these particular area median incomes. And they may have other attributes in there. You name it, sky's the limit sometimes of what they want. And that's kind of what the capital stack is to get a deal done. That's the financial attributes. That's the financial feasibility. The physical feasibility is you look at the site. What can you get onto the site? How many units? How many stories? What's the footprint? What's the parking requirement? So you're doing both of those analysis at the same time of what are my funding sources? What's my rents? What's my expenses? What pays for that construction? And then versus what can I literally physically build on here? When you do those analysis, that's kind of the deal. And then you put in your funding applications out there, you get funded, quote unquote. It's usually a two-part deal. Used to be a lot easier, but as with finite resources, things have become more difficult out there. So you get that, you put in your funding, you're designing, you're going in for your entitlements to get approvals for the cities, you're getting in for permit, you bring your debt and equity people, so your lender and your investor that have certain terms, and then voila, you close your deal, and then you build it.
And then you build it. Wow, you made it sound so easy, Steph.
So easy. It practically does it on its own, right?
Well, Steph, I'm always looking for simplest ways to explain things. How do you typically explain low-income housing tax credit to people? Like, one, where does money come from? And two, why is it even attractive for people to invest in low-income housing tax credits?
Low-income housing tax credits is basically an incentive for developers to develop affordable housing. Without that program, I don't think that there would be much of any affordable housing out there. It is really the only catalyst to get affordable housing developed. Otherwise, it would be just debt and subsidy. And imagine you would have to bring in about 30% more in subsidy to cover what you would be missing with tax credits. Tax credits are just exactly what you would think. You can boil it down to the simplest of like when you're doing your own personal tax returns, you have certain tax credits that you get. This is major corporations that have big tax exposures that try to offset it by purchasing from an intermediary, which is either a syndicator or a bank for these tax credits. And in turn, the mandate of the bank is to connect that money with a developer, and the conduit is the states have a certain allocation amount. And so they are the catalyst for working to deliver those tax credits, we'll say. And it is complicated. Imagine tax code, but it can be such a rewarding program that I think is really important. Some of the things that the federal government has done over the past few years that's been really important is fixing the 4% tax credit. Before it was below 4%, it was like 3.08. And so they actually fixed it at 4%. That generates more equity in the deal, more funds or proceeds. The thing that's at legislation that has been going through that we hope that eventually will happen is whenever you get 4% tax credits, you have to get private activity bonds to facilitate those tax credits. It's just part of the agreement. As it stands, you have to 50% of your total cost of your project has to be these tax exempt bonds. And so that 50% test, even if you don't need to take 50% in the bonds, you have to be able to get the tax credits. So what that means is you're oversubscribing the debt that's really necessary on the deal and paying like a larger amount of interest carried. So they are proposing for it to go to 25%, which would be fantastic because it solves like 3 or 4 problems. One is there's a volume cap. So there's only so many tax credits that a state can actually like deliver annually. And it's constrained by the private activity bonds. And so you would have basically double the amount of bonds to be available out there because I only have to take 25% at this point. So you would have more that could go around on the deal. So you could have more capacity for developing affordable housing. So that would be a great thing. The cost would now be less to deliver that housing because you don't have to have as high an interest carried. With the 50% test, maybe I needed $20 million in bonds, which means $20 million construction loan. Now I only have to take 10 million because sometimes I'm not even drawing down on my subsidy because I have to draw on that construction loan all the way through to that 50%. So I hold back drawing on my subsidy because I have to get through this construction loan and draw it all down in order to get the tax credits, equity. So I know that's a little bit complicated, but it is critical. Like that is like something if they did in legislation at the federal level that could create so much more capacity. Now at the state levels, it's subsidy. So the metro bonds is what we had in the Portland metro area. At the state of Oregon, the LIHTC proceeds, those have been big catalysts. But at the federal level, tax credits and that 50% test dropping to 25% test is really important. It doesn't mean that it creates more bonds. It's the use of them is not as high. So then more people can use them.
Now, let me kind of set the stage for folks too listening. I mean, the whole point of what we're trying to achieve is lowering the overall cost of capital while balancing the fact that you don't have to go on and raise equity. Because traditionally, just using a market rate development, you might see construction loans at 60, 70% loan to cost, and a developer have to go raise 30% of the equity. In an affordable deal, what we're saying here is that you don't need to go raise that 30% equity. You are getting these tax credits. So I typically like to say, hey, nonprofits typically don't really pay income taxes. So they have all these tax credits, they got to turn into money. So if I know I'm getting a $100 tax refund next year, I might say, hey, go give me $85 for the $100 tax credit that you're going to get next year. And I can use that $85 today to go build that home. That's how you translate that money next year into money today to use that to build the apartment building. So I want to kind of set the stage here, just my way of dumbing it down for me and my family, because I'm not a big LIHTC person.
Yeah, I would just say that like the state bond cap, I think for private activity bonds annually, and it's basically a per capita, I want to say it's like $450 million in the state of Oregon. Don't necessarily hold me to that, but imagine that 450 million maybe does, let's say 25 projects that is the construction required, which is the 50% of the total cost of those projects. If they dropped it to 25%, you might be able to do 50 projects. Like it's literally that impactful. Now, subsidy still has to go with those projects. So it's not the end all, it's not the silver bullet, but it is certainly a really critical piece that if we can get legislation to approve, it would free a lot of things. We have a lot of bottlenecks in the whole West Coast, typically exceeds their volume cap, meaning there might be like 800 million of deals out there and they can only fund 450 because they have this constraint with the private activity bonds.
See, that's really interesting. Have you guys ever considered like just using HUD loans for the construction and straight into like going from construction into permanent financing?
It doesn't absolve you of the private activity bonds through the HUD. It's still a private activity bonds. So if you're using 4%, 9%, you don't have to have private activity bonds. So it's not the same issue as I understand, but it's the 4% that has that constraint. It's a requirement. It's tax code requirement. So if you're getting tax credit equity, you have to get the private activity bonds. Private activity bonds, don't be confused. It really comes through as the construction loan, and it's tax exempt bonds as the construction loan, and it's a lower interest rate. So whether you're doing it through US Bank or somebody that can do a HUD loan, it's still the same deal. You still have to get that bond allocation.
Got it. And when
Yeah.
you have this private activity bond package, are you paying interest on the entire package on day one,
Great
or are
question.
you actually able to pay that down as you
Yeah.
draw?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It actually is, you have the option to do it either way. So you could do a full drawdown on that construction loan on day one, and then they put it in this thing that's called a GIC. Some people do this, and I think it's in certain interest rates environments that can be auspicious. But what is typically done in this environment, in most environments, is just a traditional construction loan that you're drawing with your draws every month, and you're drawing on your construction loan. The trick is, though, you also have these other subsidies that are coming in. So you really have to look in your cash flow of when you're drawing what sources, because you have to draw down that construction loan to hit your 50% test, or you're going to have a credit recapture. It's like super detrimental. So I could have maybe drawn on all of this other subsidy and front loaded it and waited to draw on my construction loan, but I have to hit that 50% test. So I don't. So you're paying more interest.
Right. Because I mean, you don't want to risk that piece of that. You don't want to mess up your tax credit investors in that deal. That makes a lot of sense.
Don't want to mess that up. Yeah. So that's what forces the situation. Okay. We really went onto a dark place with finance.
No, but I think, but that's why we have you on, because I think this is an area that honestly, no one really talks about stuff. It's like this mystery black box until you are like really into it and you're actually solving these problems. Because I mean, one of my mentors, he's doing 501c3 tax exempt bond executions only, but he's issuing it as a 501c3. He's not necessarily going through a government entity to go through it. So I'm always curious to hear about like, how do you combine the 4% tax credits with private activity bonds? So
yeah, I haven't worked with a 501c3, but I know a little bit about it. And I think you have to be a nonprofit to be able to work with those. Yeah. And I don't know enough of it to speak to it intelligently, but all I can say is the more tools we have in the toolbox to creatively deliver affordable housing and be good stewards of finite resources is a win. So I always say predictability, flexibility with the funding, and just like really good partnerships are the kind of the three, in my opinion, things that are like the foundations of getting projects done.
I love those principles that you just shared. Maybe let's go into like just public-private partnerships. What sort of creative ways have you seen work for public-private partnerships that have actually been successful, I guess? Like, where do you see contributions from all sides?
Yeah, I think that it can be a wonderful thing because you are leveraging everybody's expertise and resources. I feel that the value proposition that I offer as a developer is we're taking on a good amount of the risk, we're providing our expertise, we're there for execution. And so we may be partnering with a city that has a piece of land, and they really want to designate it for affordable housing, but they don't have the in-house capacity or desire to take on those risks. So that is an excellent way to partner. There could be a nonprofit partner that we would like them to come in and help us with community engagement. They might have regional expertise or an expertise around a certain like demographic population that we're trying to reach, and they could come in as a service provider and do outreach and engagement. So that is a really wonderful partnership. Working with different governmental agencies that may have land or funding to basically deliver on kind of their vision. And that's where you're also helping them kind of think through creatively, how do we do that? They may say, gosh, we know we really need early childhood education. All the data suggests that this is a great investment in youth, but we also know that we need affordable housing. How can we co-locate that? And so that's for me to go out and find the operator to figure out how you can financially and physically feasibly deliver, and come back to them and say, here's how it could look. What are your thoughts? And then having their engagement as a key stakeholder to say, well, we kind of saw it a little differently. We'd like to see it like this. And then I say, well, yeah, I know you saw it like this, but it doesn't get funded that way. Let me explain. Here's the mechanisms. And so that we work together to say, and then they come back and they say, well, the neighborhoods really wants this. So it's that collaboration, at least coming together to understand that we all have a common goal, and how do we get there? That's the key. That's the soft skills.
And I think that's
So,
like the perfect framing. I mean, you guys never know. I mean, Steph just alluded like, hey, maybe the city has a piece of land. Well, maybe the city
mhm,
has some budget to fund a soft cost. So now guess what? Now you don't have to raise money to buy the land. You don't have to raise money to for the at-risk capital to get the project approved. And who knows, maybe you can
mhm,
mix in some property tax savings. Maybe you got some guaranteed rents from the housing authorities through project-based
yep.
vouchers. Now all of a sudden you're taking risk off the table, but now you're becoming sort of a sure in when it comes to lender because they're like,
Mhm.
oh, you got from the city, you got guaranteed rents, you got property tax savings that's going to create huge NOI savings. This seems like a no-brainer. So there's all these different levers that you can pull. But again, it starts with that framing, like Steph said, of do you know what everybody wants? What do they want to prioritize? And how do you give them what they want so that we can achieve our mission of providing affordable housing?
That's exactly it. And I think, like I said, having the flexibility to be creative, the more prescriptive some of these, like we go after these RFPs for land and they're like, we want 175 units of housing. We want active street frontage, commercial space. We want a karate dojo, preschool. And you're like, okay, that is so prescriptive. How are we going to deliver that? When you're doing it in your head, like, how do you get that funded? Here's an issue. So the more flexible they can be with saying, we'd like to see a community benefiting building, focusing on affordable housing that is addressing community needs. Go get it, kid. And then the onus is on me to go out and figure out what the community needs are and bring back a compelling project that hits city initiatives. That's the better way to do it. The more prescriptive, it's like pushing all of this into this, like, what do they say? 10 pounds into a 5-pound bag can really put a lot of constraints on the deal. It just makes it really hard to get across the finish line.
Oh, that's so good. And I know how much
Mhm.
work it takes to get a project finish line step. So I mean, I think at the end of the day, what you and I really connected on was the impact we get to have on families. I know we're getting shorter in time, but I have to
Yep.
ask you, are there any stories of families that you've been able to help? Any sort of stories that you can share that can kind of inspire the audience a little bit today?
Yeah. So I think I enjoy and appreciate when you're seeing families move in to the communities and understanding really what folks are faced with, listening to stories, whether it's an immigrant refugee population and hearing kind of the trials and tribulations of finding like fair, affordable housing that's safe and sanitary and secure, watching single mothers move in and we've seen kind of all that they're faced with. I won't forget this family that came in their van. They'd been living in their van. The kids came in with their sleeping bags. It's really kind of humbling and reminds you of the great need that's out there and having compassion and understanding that this is really important. And I think the other thing that was interesting as like an asset manager and property manager is going into units. We'd have to do like certain like unit inspections. And I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about who is in affordable housing and what resident life is like. I can go into 10 different units in the same building. One will be neat as a pin and one will be thrashed as all thrashed. And I'm telling you, you cannot make generalizations of like low income people are untidy. These are all different households with all different backgrounds that have all different types of lived experience. And you can't really make those kind of generalizations. It's not an accurate way of looking. These are folks that came on hard times, some of them have been displaced, some of them it's medical bills, it's not getting opportunities, and housing stability creates opportunities for families to be able to live and have day-to-day life and support their families and their children. And that's why having a lot of really cool opportunities to bring services on site with kids, like after school programs, that's like my big motivation is moms and kids. So we've put in like music recording studios so they can have a music program and learn how to like record beats. We're working on a fiber art studio for immigrant and refugee folks to come together and share their cultures like art and fiber knowledge, multicultural reading rooms, barista and culinary training programs. These are making big differences. So the sticks and bricks are important, but a lot of it comes down to affording opportunities for stability and opportunities to have access to things that they may not otherwise have access to that can really be the spark for them to go on and do great things. That's my hope.
Well, I know that's a reality, not just a hope, because
Yeah.
I mean, one of those kids from one of those vans that jump up into one of your units, Steph, I know they're going to, who knows, one of them's going to grow up to cure cancer one day. I believe, if not in our lives, somewhere indirectly or directly, the future generation is going to pay it forward in ways for our families that we could have never imagined. And that's why I'm so grateful for you coming on, Steph. Without people like you, seriously, I would have never had the home I grew up in. When my mom walked in that home for the first time on a project-based voucher, she was in tears. She was so happy. She didn't have to worry about someone climbing through our second floor window and robbing us. And without people like you, I would have never had the home I grew up in. I would have never been able to start this podcast to welcome someone like you and thank you for what you do, because we need more people like you, honestly, Steph, that has put in all the work, so many hours of sweat and tears to make these projects come to life. And sometimes we think these buildings just go up on their own, but that's not the case. And for people that are out there right now listening in, you want to make an impact. Maybe you grew up in a family with a single mom. You can build an apartment building. Not saying it's easy, but you can build an apartment building and put a daycare center right in the bottom so that that single mom can go to work, so that that child has adequate care and love right down there. I mean, this is all within your power. And I'm hoping that this conversation today inspires you to take action, to learn more about this affordable housing industry, because it's not just guns, drugs, and drama. It's people just like our parents that just wanted to put food on the table and worked really hard so that they can provide for their children. So I'm so grateful for that. And Steph, this is one of the questions I ask every single guest on the podcast, and I'm curious to hear your view. Why do you think affordable housing, particularly the lack of supply of affordable housing, is just so hard to solve for?
Well, I think that there is an amalgam of issues. Personally, I think the short-term rental market has exacerbated the issues of housing. Unfortunately, it's created economic opportunity for middle class and upper class individuals to easily own second, third, fourth homes, but it is causing quite a lot of issues in many communities, especially tourism communities. I grew up in a small town, a small coastal town, and the housing crisis is just so exacerbated in those areas because of short-term rentals. It might not be popular that I say that, but I think that that is a component of it. It's taking a lot of housing stock off of the market. I think after the Great Recession, we've never caught up with the housing stock. We're so far behind. And now we're in a big economic situation with interest rates and inflation that has further exacerbated that issues in many, many markets, especially the Oregon markets, the coastal West Coast. So we get further behind. And I think that we should be doing more out there from a federal perspective. And I do think that there is one presidential candidate that is really platforming on housing, which is the first time ever. And so I'm very hopeful that that's being paid attention to. And I'm very supportive of that because states can only do so much. We need our federal government to enact policy and bring opportunity to create more housing, or we are never going to get ahead of this. So
thank you, Steph. I appreciate your perspective so much. And it's always great to hear from someone that's experienced as you and also doing such amazing things for our community. Thank you so much. I honestly, I can't wait till my 3-year-old daughter grows up and listens to this podcast. It's going to be one of the first podcasts I make her listen to. But this has been such an amazing conversation, Steph. And for people that want to find out more about you or get in touch with you, where might they be able to follow you?
I'm not a real social media lady, so that will be hard, but I do LinkedIn, so you could look me up on LinkedIn and reach out. But yeah, I'm not really out there. I'm too busy with developing but I really appreciate, I just wanted to say, I think that what you're doing is so important. I am really impressed with your knowledge and your energy for this. And so I really feel that just appreciate you reaching out. So good job. You're good.
Thank you so much, Steph. I appreciate you. And hopefully I can bring you back on when we get to your next groundbreaking or get to your next move-in day, because I would love to bring you on just for you to share the stories of those folks that are moving into their units for the first time. Because if we can just inspire more people to come into this industry, I know that's at least part of the solution. So thank you so much, Steph. I appreciate you so much. All right. And we are out.